beginning a new teaching series this week. And as Oz mentioned last week, we're going to be looking at a different big question that's raised by parts of the Bible each week. Now, you might have questions about these ideas yourselves, like why are there so many slaves throughout the biblical stories? Why doesn't God do something to solve the suffering that we see in the world? To name a couple of examples. Our hope is that through this series, we can engage with questions that people around us might be asking, as well as ourselves, about Christianity, and gain confidence helping them to grapple with them. We're not seeking to provide all the answers to these questions, and we truly believe that only when we meet God face to face will we fully feel at peace with them. But we hope that by sharing some insights from various sources we've engaged with, might be an encouragement that these questions needn't fill us with the dread that I think they sometimes do. Now, most of you know that I teach science to large children as a day job. But before I did that, I went to university and learned about biology from various large professors. It seemed to me at the time that they varied on a spectrum of beliefs ranging from fully atheists who were decisively dismissive of anything religious being involved with anything scientific whatsoever, all the way to the few of them who were slightly more tolerant about discussing issues of faith within a scientific worldview, but they didn't really have time for lengthy discussions on the topic. They seemed to me to consider it a bit of a foregone conclusion that religion and science didn't really have anything to say to each other. In my first year at university, I had lots of modules that attempted to cover the basics of biology, including one called The Origin of Life. Attending these lectures, for me, was a bit of a source of tummy-fluttering anxiety. I'd only just decided, before going to university, to commit myself to following Jesus, having lived a pretty agnostic adolescence. So much of my thoughts at the time were taken up with the worry that this lecturer was at some point going to drop some massive bombshell that would torpedo my very, very young faith, and that my idea of being a Christian not being incompatible with being a scientist would be left dead in the water. I think I also had a bit of that giddy zeal that new Christians often have. I thought to myself, I can fight the good fight here. I can talk to my friends about the idea of the beginnings of life, etc. Now, that faith-destroying bombshell never came. Yet I found myself unable to get any serious traction with my course mates in trying to convince them that Christianity was worth considering seriously. Whenever questions about evolutionary theory would come up against the elephant in the room of Genesis, I'd usually be left deflecting to other questions that I was more confident answering. It felt as if my wheels were spinning in the mud. Now, after more weeks and months of listening to course mates and lecturers disparage the idea of a specially created human species, I started wondering how I could possibly pursue a scientific career when the whole field of evolutionary biology seemed hell-bent on disproving and discrediting the Genesis creation account, which I was starting to be encouraged to take seriously. All the objections I'd stuffed deep down about the creation accounts in Genesis started welling back up inside me. You've probably heard most of them yourselves. It was written by a pre-scientific civilization. They barely understood the first thing about the sun and the moon. It was written, or parts of it don't even make sense. How could you have light created before the sun and the stars? Hasn't modern science disproved the idea of living beings being created across 6 24-hour periods? There are millions of years between emergence of some species, not hours. And perhaps most painful to hear, the claim, it's just a children's story. What if instead of shyly shrugging our shoulders when we're asked about the creation stories in Genesis, and acting as if they aren't that important anyway, we were able to explain that these stories are fundamental to our understanding of our place in the world, and even more fundamental to our understanding of who our Creator is. In the Apostle Peter's first recorded letter to persecuted Christians in what's now modern-day Turkey, he encourages them to, in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord, and always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. Now, we might be prepared to explain maybe who Jesus is and what he's done for us, but we might find ourselves often being tripped up and then distracted down a rabbit hole by a question about whether creation actually happened over 6 days, or whether Adam and Eve were real people or not. And then the real impactful conversation about Jesus gets forgotten. I'd love it if through this sermon we could feel a bit more comfortable talking about the beginning of Genesis. And if we were able to give some answers that are intellectually satisfying to the curious. let's see if we can tease out some of the messages that the author of Genesis was trying to convey to its original audience, and how we should be using it to speak to us today. Now, those of you with children will know that they are experts at using objects for other purposes than which they were intended, right? A pile of cushions is a fort. A bunch of Lego minis are a 10-pin bowling set. And the food on your plate is absolutely anything but that which goes in your mouth, right? How many parents have got children that went through the junk modeling phase? Did you have this? It's basically where your children upend your recycling bin on the floor and then make sure that you can't find a single pair of scissors or roll of tape ever again. We've had robots of every shape and size, some kind of car that acts as a water dispenser with an actual glass Schlur bottle taped to the top. Not that keen on that one myself. And everything in between, it feels like. And as we grow up, we tend to get a little bit more literal about our possessions. And we might maybe be found using a bank statement as a coaster on occasion, but usually using things for which they were built becomes the norm. So how should we be using the book of Genesis? What is its purpose? How about the first 3 chapters of Genesis, where we heard the world and its living things are created, and we read about God's first interactions with the first humans? Is it eyewitness testimony that should be treated as admissible evidence in a court hearing against one Sir Pent? Is it more of a do-it-yourself guide to universe creation? Just follow these 6 simple steps and you too can be an omnipotent creator. Is it just anti-snake propaganda? C.S. Lewis once wrote, "The first qualification for judging any piece of workmanship from a corkscrew to a cathedral is to know how it was meant to be used." Before we can decide how we're going to read and understand Genesis, we should really try to understand why it was written in the first place. I think we're all guilty of imagining some of the Old Testament as being kind of written in a vacuum, as if their only purpose was to be handed down faithfully to us today to learn from. We imagine this to our undoing, I think. If we're going to give the creation accounts of Genesis a fair hearing, we're going to need to understand both the purpose for which they were written and something about the people that it was written to. As Old Testament scholar John Walton put it, Scripture was written for us, but it was not written to us. Now, as with most ancient sources of text, like those in the Old Testament, it's really difficult to put an exact date on when we think it was written down and put in the form that we have it today. Now, in the case of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Jews would call that the Torah. That's the ones including Genesis as its first. This is a lot harder because we don't think they were all written down on paper in one go. And likely they were put together using stories that had been passed down orally for centuries, as well as some written sources, and finished maybe only by about the 5th or 6th century BC. To put that in perspective, the final truly transcribed version of Genesis that we have in our Bibles today perhaps wasn't realized until about 800 years after Moses' death. Now, when Moses is often credited as possible author of Genesis, that puts in perspective a little bit as to widespread reading of this book wasn't happening until a lot longer after. Now, oral tradition means that Moses and the people after him would be sharing that story, but in a written version, we're talking a lot later. Now, you might be surprised to hear that large chunks of the Old Testament probably weren't written down close to the original events. And maybe that raises doubts for you as to whether that's trustworthy information. But this was really common. It was a really effective practice back in Old Testament days to be passing on this stuff orally. It's oral tradition, as it was called. It became really effective as a way to faithfully transmit information that you wanted to pass through generations, because simply writing on papyrus scrolls hadn't been adopted by most cultures in the Near East at that point. In those days, if you wanted to pass information on through the generations, you had no choice. You had to do it orally, which meant that cultures in the Old Testament period became really, really good at doing it. Now, we don't have time to explore that claim fully today, but for our purposes, let's assume a reasonable amount of confidence that stories passed down from Moses' time hadn't changed significantly from their original tellings. However much our Western brains, which love things to be written down at the moment at which they were happening, scream at us to object. So what's undeniably true then is that Genesis was written within a culture and within a geography that's vastly different from ours today. Unavoidably, this means that our initial assumptions when we read it get tainted by our Western expectations on a piece of historical literature. Like if I read a book on the Battle of Waterloo, I expect to be able to find out the names of the participants, the outcome, the number of casualties on each side. Give me the facts. When we come across a book that seems to be talking about the creation of the world, we assume from our viewpoint that that's the size of it. We assume that Genesis is claiming a straightforward CCTV footage style account of the history of the world. Our culture has this obsession for explaining the material world and its origins and leaving no stone unturned in the pursuit of doing that. And it's this worldview that makes us assume that that's all Genesis is. It's like a science textbook, like telling the Jews how they believe the world and its creatures were created because, well, that's what it says. But is this what a member of ancient Israel, the people hearing this for the first time, would have understood it to be saying? That's the question we need to ask. Now, Genesis was written in a time and a place in history where there were lots of contrasting beliefs about the origins of the world and the place of humans within it. Many of these early religions contained the idea of a chaotic, destructive birth for the earth. For example, Babylonian creation stories involved chaos dragons fighting each other at the beginning of the universe, where one of the older dragon gods, called Tiamat, is killed by the younger Marduk, with Tiamat's corpse falling to the ground and splitting to form the sky and the earth. Now, Jews of the ancient Near East were constantly being conquered, taken into slavery by rival empires such as Babylon, who worshipped these gods. In their time, the Jews' time, evolutionary theory wasn't the ultimate enemy that needed rescuing from, or in our case, an effective debating strategy against. It was the allure of the gods of Babylon, of Egypt and Assyria, and the mistreatment by the people of those empires. So if this was the context that ancient Israel was receiving, those creation stories of Genesis, then what should we expect these stories to emphasize about their God? One aspect, I think, is found in the fourth word of Genesis. It's a massive and immediate rebuttal to every other empire of the day. In the beginning, God. Now, something that marked all other religions as similar were the creation stories of their gods, accompanying which came the creation usually of all the matter in the world, often in, as I said, this chaotic and accidental manner. Genesis not only confidently asserts the belief that there being only one God, but also that this God brought order to the chaos, but that this God was there at the beginning. He didn't need to be created. Whereas other gods would struggle to wrestle mighty beasts of the sea into submission to show their strength, God simply commanded all living beasts of the air, land, and sea to exist. Now, if you're an ancient worshipper of the gods of Babylon, this is a put-down to end all put-downs, right? This is the Jews telling them that their God, Yahweh, is the God of all other gods, that he was there before all of them, and that he doesn't need to wrestle the world into existence. He simply commands it to be. The ancient Egyptians were famous for their worship of the sun god, Ra. Now, this wasn't unusual, as I'm sure you know, in the ancient world. So numerous were the beliefs of ancient people in gods that controlled the weather, the tides, the seasons, that Israel's belief in there only being one God who was in control of it all would have seemed ridiculous. In contrast to Egypt's belief in Ra, the sun god, and the Canaanite belief in Yarek, the moon god, the writer of Genesis puts forward that the greater and lesser lights, the sun and moon, were simply spoken into being by God. In the ancient Israel worldview, they're objects, not spiritual forces to be feared and worshipped, way ahead of their time, scientifically, you could say. To an ancient Egyptian, this would have been interpreted plainly as our God created what you worship as God. Genesis is making the bold statement that this God is the only God, and he stands far above the powers that you think are in charge. So from the violence and anxiety of these ancient Near East creation narratives to the peace-inducing authority of Yahweh. Nobody reading Genesis in ancient times would have failed to spot those comparisons being made between the Jewish God and these other gods who have created the world in a violent, chaotic birth. we can start to see here how it's so important that we consider the original audience of every bit of the Bible when we're figuring out what it has to say to us. Genesis was not written as a response to Stephen Hawking's view on the origin of the universe, nor was it written to provide an alternative explanation for evolutionary theory, so we shouldn't expect it to. Now, something I've been learning about through an excellent podcast recently is just how much Hebrew literature, so that's the Old Testament particularly, is unwilling generally to give you quick answers to important questions. Western writing, which began with Greek writing at the time of the New Testament, is often produced with the purpose of promoting the fastest possible understanding on an idea through laying out hypotheses, testing, conclusions, whereas Hebrew authors, they wanted their readers to have to spend time reading, rereading, reflecting on the text, in order to mine it for understanding. Their idea was that only through repeated readings, discussion, theories, counter-theories, and turning the text upside down and shaking it, could you reach the deep level of meaning and understanding, what we might oversimplify as heart knowledge, that God seeks us to have of him. Old Testament writers wanted their readers to wrestle with the text, and that by doing this, God will form our minds better into what he created them for. Podcast in question is called Bema, by the way. It's spelled B-E-M-A. I thoroughly recommend it. So we've looked at Genesis 1, where the world and its creatures were created, and we can see how the messages on display are quite possibly less about how did the world come to be, and more about who the God is that existed before all of it. We should now spend a bit of time wrestling with chapter 2 of Genesis, where we seem to get an in-depth look at the creation of humans. Now, understandably, considerable time in the discussion around science and Genesis is given over to this question of human origins. Where did we come from? Specifically, were they created from dirt, as is literally written in Genesis 2, separate from all the other creatures, or did they emerge from another similar species at a specific point in time, a la theory of evolution? Now let's hold that idea that we've just mentioned about wrestling with the text in our minds as we approach this section. Now, one possible interpretation that we could have of the Genesis accounts is that perhaps Adam and Eve are humans that never truly existed, but they demonstrate to us important broad ideas, the unity with God that we were created for, and the decisions we make that separate us between us and the Almighty. Adam is more the archetype for the human race rather than its literal founder, you could say. Now, this handily chimes with an evolutionary point of view, where some might go so far as to hypothesize that evolution was a guided process by God towards the creation of humanity, and that God then chose humans, perhaps Abraham. Some people think maybe he'd be the first actually existing human in the histories that God interacts with, from that pool to be his people. And that's where the more literal history of Genesis starts. One of the various problems with that point of view, though, is that both Jesus and Paul, one of the apostles in the New Testament, both refer to Adam as if he really did exist, being the one through whom sin entered the world through specific actions. We read this in Paul's letter to the Roman church. He references Adam's role in the fall. He writes, "For just as the disobedience of the one man, Adam, many were made sinners, also through the obedience of the one man, Jesus, the many will be made righteous." Paul's drawing a parallel between Adam, the first man to pull away from God's design for humanity, and Jesus, the first and only man to draw us fully back to God and his design for humanity. And when warning his disciples to be wary of hypocritical believers, Jesus in Matthew's Gospel makes reference to the blood of Adam's murdered son, Abel. Now, it's possible that they're referring to a figurative person of persons in Adam, but especially in Paul's writings, it doesn't often come across that way. So, second interpretation. Perhaps Adam did exist, but he was an evolved mammal. So evolved that God took a special interest in him and bestowed upon him a soul and a rapid acceleration in cognitive development, so that he and his descendants were able to dominate over the earth. This approach is helped further by the subtle suggestion in Genesis that there were other humans around at the time of Adam and Eve. And this would also provide a handy explanation to why Adam and his family didn't suffer all the problems of genetic inbreeding over the generations. I don't know if anybody else has thought of that. That's possibly just the biology teacher in me. However, this approach does seem again to ignore one really important part of the Genesis accounts. The idea that God was specially involved in an intimate way in the creation of humans. In Genesis, humans don't seem to be the end result of a series of fortunate accidents, as Darwin's natural selection would say, and instead have been intentionally created for a purpose. In Genesis 1:27, we read, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them." Now, this verse comes at the end of the Genesis 1 creation account, and it's structured as a poem. If you read it in your Bibles, if you read it just then, you might have noticed that it's kind of in a separate paragraph to the rest. You generally find that when there's a poem being given. It's kind of like a mirroring. The first line mirrors the last line. And poetry in the Old Testament is really important. It's usually a sign that the Jewish writers want to draw your attention to something. It's as if the writer of Genesis is saying that the creation of humans, in all of creation, is God's crowning achievement and his greatest pride and joy. It's not something that lends itself to the idea of evolution by random natural selection. Now, my imagination has been back and forth on this spectrum more times than I can count. I'm immediately attracted to the evolution-based explanations to our existence because they match up with science that I've learned in school and university, and I've taught for years at school as well. I'm also a bit of a fact organizer. I like it when explanations fit neatly together in my brain without much need for unexplained gaps, However, the least convincing part for me about the evolutionary theory of human origins is that it can't satisfyingly explain the depths to which we feel things, our capacity for love, and more generally, the consciousness that allows us to both hold a relationship with God at the same time as wrestling with this complex and wonderful text that has the ability to throw up as many questions as it does affirmations to my faith. I've often got a little bit worried, I don't know if any of you feel the same way, about having to present my understanding of parts of the Bible that seem initially out of step with the modern world and its beliefs about humanity. A bit like when you've got to go up to the front of the class and show the model bridge that you made out of straws and glue, but you're a bit embarrassed about how it turned out. And you stand there holding this messy structure of bits that you didn't really manage to build properly because you left the instruction sheet at school and it was all in Hebrew anyway. And you've now got to stand there and justify to the class what you did or what you believe. Not having all the answers when we're fronted up by Western culture's insistence that we should be able to fill in all the gaps with concrete explanations can feel like a really unattractive prospect, and it sometimes puts us off wanting to try. There's a Jewish festival, I don't know if you know about this, called Simchat Torah, or Rejoicing of the Torah, in which Jews get together and celebrate by dancing around with Torah scrolls. Maybe this would be a bit like us taking our Bibles and dancing around the back on a Sunday. Pretty wild, but a lot of Judaism is like that. There's no studying that happens on this festival. And if you know anything about Jews, they love to study the world, so that's to be noted. The Torah scrolls gets closed up and sealed in velvet. Nobody reads to the congregation, and no rabbi gets up to preach. This isn't just a good excuse for a party. What Simchat Torah is recognizing is that we will never know everything about God or his creation. And that's worth celebrating. Why? Because not understanding every mystery of God's creation just demonstrates how huge and beyond our capacity to imagine he is. Would you not be disappointed by a God whose works could be summed up on the back of a napkin? I think I would. I wouldn't know if that would be a God worth believing. Jews take this idea of not knowing so differently to the way that we do in the West. We become obsessed and fearful about our lack of knowledge, as if we should be able to explain and understand every little thing. We trap ourselves into the belief that until we've squared away every little issue I've got with these creation stories and the rest of the Bible as a whole, then I can't begin to take them seriously. Yes, God created us with curious minds, and one day we will have a field day understanding how many literal 24-hour periods was creation accomplished in. But if we're failing to see the main messages that these texts are trying to get across, and instead get completely caught up in the who, the what, the where, and the how of creation, then we're missing the greatest question of them all. The only one that's going to matter at the end of time. The only one that the author of Genesis strives so hard to answer for us. And that, of course, is why. Genesis tells us that we are special to God and set apart from the rest of creation, that we were created to be loved, not to be slaves and live a life of cruel service as the other gods would have of us. Genesis tells us that our God is bigger and greater than any god that a human could devise or choose to worship. Genesis tells us that we are no random accident, that whether we were evolved or created from dust, that we came about through an act of intentional will by the most loving being to have ever existed. And if that wasn't enough, he has also thrown open the gates of heaven to offer us all a way back to him through Jesus. In Genesis, we see the first time, literal or not, where humanity turns their back on God's way and decided to go it alone in pursuit of a story we wanted to write for ourselves, one where we're at the center and where we've pushed God, who thought that we were the pinnacle of his creation, to the margins or forgotten entirely. In the book of Romans, Jesus is written about as the new Adam. God made man who lived the way that God designed for us, in the way that he intended humanity to. He is our example, as well as the one who enables us through his death to enter back into the Garden of Eden, to be with God. So next time we're reading the first couple of chapters of Genesis, and let me encourage you to do so once this week. Go back to it if you haven't read it in a while. Let's read it slowly. Let's wrestle with the text and not expect it to give us answers that we seek straight off the surface. That's not how this literature works. Let's try and appreciate the God who's behind this creation, as well as the majesty displayed by creation itself. Let's wrestle with the text and look for the lessons about God that the authors of Genesis wanted so deeply for us to find, but didn't want to make finding them so easy that they failed to impact our hearts. Get together with a friend. Read it verse by verse even. Let's see how God is going to use these stories in a new way to enlighten you to who he is. God doesn't want us to stuff our curious minds away in a box when we read the Bible. I like to think that he finds the same joy in us uncovering the mysteries of his creation through scientific discovery as I take in my son uncovering the wonders of Tolkien's Middle-earth. But he also doesn't want us, through our exploration of the natural world and our origins, good though they may be, to become distracted from the pursuit to which he called us from the beginning. That is to know him, to love him with all our heart, our mind, our soul, and strength, and to share that self-sacrificial love with everyone we meet. Father God, I just want to ask for your blessing as we hear more about you this afternoon, as we worship now and as we bring our hearts to reflect on these questions and our understanding of who you are and what you've created us for. That you would meet with us, that you would enable our hearts to be open and receptive to what it is you might have to say to us. In Jesus' name, amen.